Welcome to the Dispatch Podcast. I'm Sarah Isger, joined by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg. But we have a special guest today, Alex Thompson, national political correspondent at Axios. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Let's start with the run-up to the press conference that President Biden held at NATO this week. Alex, what was the mood from the White House, from Democrats on the Hill before the press conference?
Well, within the White House and the Biden campaign, there's really a split. The higher up in the org chart you go, really, the more there is this attitude of there is just this is a freak out, that there's a bunker mentality, that this is just the latest of people doubting Joe Biden and him, getting back up and is going to recover and persevere. Then, throughout the White House, it's really split. There are people that are demoralized. There are some people that, especially the ones that didn't see Biden on a day-to-day basis, a feeling of disillusionment, feeling that maybe senior staff were, obscuring or not telling the truth about any limitations that he had. And then, if you're on a campaign and you just moved to Wilmington, Delaware, you're, pretty low morale.
You're checking your lease, seeing what the out clauses are.
If you just moved to Wilmington, Delaware for any reason, you're probably pretty low morale.
And then, Democrats in Congress, even despite only probably, I don't know what the count is now, I think it's just over a dozen have urged him to step aside or, change the language, behind closed doors, they're freaking out. And they're freaking out because they're worried that they could lose their own jobs. They're worried that Donald Trump could win. And also they're worried because they don't know what to do about it. There are no good options. Even if you are saying, let's get rid of Joe Biden tomorrow, it's still very messy. You either have an unpopular vice president at the top of the ticket who at least voters don't question her age, or you go to an open convention, which has its own risks because the Democratic convention doesn't end until just a month before early voting. So that, I guess, is like the state of play.
That was heading into the press conference. And I was wondering whether there was a sense that some people were holding their powder dry for the press conference, basically assuming that President Biden would not do well, and then the floodgates could kind of be released, and this would all take care of itself. And that's not what happened at the press conference. I'd love your feelings on the press conference, but more now, post-press conference, do Democrats feel more stuck, resigned to their fate?
I think they're going to continue to keep their powder dry. I mean, you can't hide Biden all the way to August, to the convention. So he has a Lester Holt interview on Monday. He's going to be out and about. The Biden team is also, Trump is likely to select his vice presidential nominee in the coming days. The RNC will start. Press attention will probably wane a bit. And then Democrats, I'm not resigned to the fate. I also think there's this increasing sense that it's not helpful to go public, not just because it creates more media, but also because it makes Biden dig in more. It was interesting. Jim Clyburn went on the Today Show just this morning, and we're talking Friday morning, and basically said, give him the space. Like, he's earned the right to give space. And I think it's partly because you're seeing, and you already saw it in the way that Democrats were talking in their statements about Joe Biden, because the first half of every statement was about how great Joe Biden was and how historic he was and everything else. And part of that is because Democrats are tiptoeing around his ego with a lot of these things.
Steve, what did you feel at the end of the press conference?
I think you're right. And I think the framing of your question to Alex was right. If people were waiting for another disastrous performance like the one they saw at the debate, that's not what Biden gave us. There wasn't, an 8-second glitch or whatever it was, as there was in the debate. So in that sense, he survived. And I think that's, that is the way that most people are characterizing his performance.
That's now the metric of success, literal and metaphorical survival.
I suppose that's where we are right now. But I think if you apply to Joe Biden's press conference the same set of sort of judgments that you would apply to a president who's not struggling the way that he is with cognitive decline, this would have been a dramatic failure of a press conference. I mean, he opened the press conference really in response to the first statement after he read from the teleprompter. I thought his reading from the teleprompter was halting. Dr. L. Shiva Coleman, the University of Chicago neurologist I spoke to last week about President Biden about these things, said that reading is often the last thing to go. Usually you can get through a reading without struggling. I thought he struggled. I thought it was halting. After that, he opened his press conference by mistaking Vice President Harris for President Trump. He said he wasn't going to follow the advice of the commander-in-chief, and then he corrected to military chief of staff. He talked pretty openly about how he needs to pace himself, better manage his schedule to accommodate these challenges. His answer on Ukraine and ability to strike into Russia, I thought, was mostly gibberish. He said the following sentence: "We're going to make sure that rents are kept at 5% increase. Corporate rents for apartments and the like. Homes are limited to 5%. No idea what that means. There were many other non sequiturs, halting statements. And this was all, of course, just a couple hours after he introduced Volodymyr Zelensky as Vladimir Putin. So to me, that's not a good night. Is it a night enough to stem Democrat complaints and keep people from sort of flooding the public with requests that he resign? Maybe. But it wasn't a good night, I think, if we're not grading on a massive, massive curve.
Jonah, here seems to be the biggest problem for Democrats politically. I take Steve's point that perhaps we should be grading the president on whether he's good at being president or even a good candidate. But that's not what we're grading. We're grading whether he can even stay the candidate or stay president. And I think to the extent that's the curve or that's the test, however you want to think about it, he passed that test, not with flying colors, but he passed it. And so we move on. This is the problem for Democrats, though. Like Alex's point, now there's the Lester Holt interview. Then there will be more press conferences, more interviews. And if he fails any one of them, that's the end of the ball game. And as you get closer and closer to that roll call vote that's currently scheduled for August 7th, the situation gets more and more dire. Like if he has a debate-like performance interview, on August 6th, but he does mediocrely well, like Steve said, between now and August 6th, what the hell do they do then? And so I think that's the biggest problem for Democrats, is not that they don't think Joe Biden's great or not. It's the concern that a good performance, a mediocre performance, whatever it is, actually makes this situation worse. Because, of course, the worst case scenario isn't August 6th. The worst case scenario is August 8th, right? It's after the first ballot where he gets the majority of DNC delegates. And then there's a problem. Then it just gets that much harder. Then you're in Access Hollywood territory in 2016, where Republicans could talk a big game about replacing Trump on the ballot, but not really. That's not an option practically at that point. So, it didn't open the floodgates, but I do wonder if we're still going to see the anonymous sources from the White House, from the campaign, as Alex said, not because they think it'll move Joe Biden. Clearly it won't. But for their own credibility down the road?
Look, there are, for the country, for the Democratic Party, and frankly for the Republican Party too, for all of us who care about politics and the direction of the country, the only meals on the menu are crap sandwiches, right? So pick the one with the best bread that you like, because that's the best you can make of this situation. Now, you've been making this point for a while now, Sarah, that the good performances don't really matter if you expect that there will be one more bad one coming or 5 more bad ones coming, right? It's like, if you know that you're going to stumble while walking a tightrope eventually, who cares about how many steps you take that go fine, right? And so it's a numbers game. If you just believe that Biden is going to have another bad episode or several at some point in public between now and the convention or now and the election, best to just simply deal with that fact when you have the most time left on the calendar to deal with it. That's the dilemma for the Democrats. And it seems to me that they are not confronting it. Well, I mean, James Carville and Paul Begala and those guys are, and David Axelrod is trying valiantly. But for most of these guys, it's like, what does it Yogi Berra say? I came to a fork in the road and I took it. They just don't. It's like every day they pull off the Band-Aid a little bit and then they press it back down and stick it back on. And I think that's unsustainable. And I just want to make one last point, which just doesn't get mentioned a lot, which is that presidents who are campaigning for re-election aren't supposed to be campaigning to prove that they're compos mentis. They're supposed to be campaigning to prove that they deserve another 4 years. None of Biden's campaigning is about that, to the extent it's even campaigning. And I take a backseat to very few in my criticisms of Kamala Harris. I don't think she was a good pick. I don't think she's a particularly good politician. But you know what she can do? She can campaign. She can, she's not Brick Tamlin from Anchorman when asked about abortion in a debate, right? I mean, she would not frumfer about sisters raping their sisters and then say we beat Medicare in response to a question about abortion. This is not high praise, but that's the thing. And so I think they're in an untenable situation. At some point, if the conversation actually focuses on, is he okay to govern for 4 more years, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
So, Alex, let's go back in time a little bit. As you know, I'm friends with Rob Hur. I worked with Rob Hur at the Department of Justice. And I remember so clearly this conversation that I had with Rob, and I'll only share my side of it because I haven't talked to him about this. But after his report came out, I remember texting him and saying, "You're Cassandra at the gates," right? This idea that you're telling everyone the problem and what's going to happen, and nobody's going to listen to you because that's not the moment we're in. And instead, they're going to, attack you, your motives, what a bad guy you are, rather than listen to what you're trying to tell the country. And maybe more importantly, Democrats here with 6-8 months left to go before they actually solidify who their nominee was. There was time at that point to have a robust primary with real candidates jumping in. And instead they said Rob Hur somehow wanted a judicial appointment from Donald Trump. With that in mind, what grade would you give the media's coverage of this issue before the debate for the whole presidency running up to the debate? And, whether you think it was an issue or it's a relatively new issue, like you can factor all that in.
I'm not going to directly give it a grade just because I'm not a media reporter. And I think I don't think it would be a good grade. How about that? And, the Hur report was really, I think, the moment when covering the age is difficult because you can observe it and you can talk about it. But it is, because they limited access to him, it's tough to report in some of the ways. It is tough to report. But after Hur, who was the person that, had, I guess, 5 hours of access to Joe Biden. And not only did he interview him, but then the transcript was released. And the transcript is very clear that he is all over the place, right? He is, you just read it and it's so discursive and he does jumble and he has these very weird mental lapses throughout it. I think in retrospect, if you look back at the coverage of the release of the Hur transcript, a lot of the coverage has not aged well. The transcript has moments of great lucidity and recall, and then also some of these other bad moments. And I think the problem is the fact that he had the bad moments was the news, because if the president of the United States, you have to remember the Hur report. I think the Hur interview was October 8th. And October 9th, or it's right around October 7th. If he's having some of these little, brain burps at all, I think that was worth, increasing scrutiny, especially given that he had done less interviews with tough reporters than any president in decades. And, I think the turning point for that, like in retrospect, he did a decent amount of interviews the first year, but like after the really catastrophic George Stephanopoulos interview during Afghanistan, which is aged, if you go back and read it, it is aged so poorly. He promised that he wouldn't withdraw troops until all the American citizens were out. 10 days later, he withdraws all the troops. Hundreds of American citizens are left. I mean, after that interview, they really circled the wagons with tough interviews. I think Jake Tapper snuck one in because he got Biden called him and Tapper got him to commit, but like really they did not open him up. So that was my own long discursive answer, but that's sort of where I land. And I think the her stuff, you can quibble with maybe some of the ways, and some people in the Biden administration still quibble with some of the ways he wrote the report, but now feel that the report has certainly aged. And one last thing about the her thing. I think the way they tried to discredit him, right? It was Trump appointed Robert Hur. And then there was even like Oppo floating out, within progressive circles about him. So there was a determined effort to discredit him in order to discredit the report.
And Steve, just to sort of summarize the Hur report, right? It was this idea that there was evidence that Biden had willfully retained national security information in violation of federal law, but that Robert Hur did not believe he could get a conviction in front of a jury because he didn't think the jury would believe that Biden remembered doing it, even if he had done it.
Yeah.
That seems pretty indisputable now.
No, totally vindicated. Absolutely. I think you walked through the history. Well, Alex, I'd love to follow up because I think Jonah had a really good G-file about this earlier this week. And I think the big debate about sort of the media's performance has missed a number of things. It isn't the case, as many of our friends on the right are claiming, that there was some massive conspiracy and all these left-wing journalists just like huddled together and decided that they weren't going to tell the country that Joe Biden is having cognitive struggles. But at the same time, when you look back on it, it's a huge missed story. And I can say this to you because you didn't really miss the story. A lot of your reporting early on got at aspects of this. I can't remember the exact date. You can tell me, but I think it was like April 2023. You reported on the shortened schedule that Joe Biden was doing. And, there were elements of your reporting. You were also doing some reporting for a book in addition to the reporting that you were doing for Axios. I think you were really trying to sort of penetrate this and get a full understanding. Is the reason that the country didn't get a better sense of exactly how quick the decline or where we were sort of in the decline because it's so hard to nail down? It is hard if he's not being exposed to journalists. It is hard to ask those questions, and it's hard if you have a ring around Joe Biden that's determined not only to tell you no, what you're hearing isn't true or what you think you're seeing isn't accurate, but also pushing back very, very hard and almost shaming journalists who had the audacity to ask these questions. And I know this because I've talked to some journalists who are on the receiving end of this, like sort of a how dare you ask these questions. And I wonder to what extent that back and forth between journalists covering the White House and the Biden's administration, really senior officials at insistence that there was nothing wrong and that it was somehow inappropriate to ask plays a role in both the collective missing of the big parts of this story early. And it, again, I should point out, a lot of people did have elements of this reporting. It's not that it was entirely missed. There were reporters who covered this, but broadly, we didn't appreciate exactly where things were. How much of that is a part of this tension that I'm describing?
Yeah, I think the White House was very effective and incredibly aggressive to any reporter that asked questions about the age. And I think, there was, if you're not getting access to the president, then there should have been more curiosity as to why that is, rather than just sort of accepting and not every reporter did accept it, but accepting, oh, well, he still does the quick, 1-2 questions when he's walking to, when they asked, when he was walking to Marine One, whenever a reporter asked, well, why isn't he doing interviews? Why is he doing press conference? They'd be like, well, he's done a historic number of these like little pull-asides. And, the few times when, you would see him sort of unscripted would be at fundraisers, but then they started, adding teleprompters to the fundraisers, and he was having these big note cards at the fundraisers. But then even so, he would still make, these gaffes. Like one I distinctly remember was in September. It was last fall, and he talked about Charlottesville and it being the motivation why he ran, but then he told the story almost word for word, just minutes apart, and got some attention at the time, but then it very quickly, there wasn't a lot of follow-up. It sort of quickly went away. The other thing I would say is, I became more aggressive about it once he declared for re-election, because in my mind, it was just like, you have to think about 86, not how he is right now. So anything that is happening now is, you have to think about it like beyond the November. It's more than if he can beat Donald Trump. It's about, does he have the mental fitness to serve another, at that point, 5 years? And I think there was a little bit of like just focus on the election. The other thing, just as part of the context of this, I do think there's a world in which, he did, like, I noticed the slip. And one thing I always did was I really would always gut check with the White House photographers, the New York Times photographers, the Wire photographers, because they notice everything. They notice every little adjustment, every little change in how the team is orchestrating the president. And you could tell, especially like starting last summer, and some people close to the president sort of speculate that, like, this is also when the Hunter plea deal unravels. That is when you start seeing the ramp get a little bit steeper downward, and it seemed to get worse. Especially the physical aspects of it started to get worse at a faster rate.
We've now seen, since the debate, a very aggressive White House press corps on these questions, almost an obsessive White House press corps. And I think the sort of conspiracy that you're getting from the Sean Hannity right is they just all want to get him out. They're on the Democrats team. They're doing this to get him out. This is all political. It seems to me that the likelier explanation is they felt burned by the aggressive ways in which the White House had said, hey, look, there's no issue here. You're crazy. This is inappropriate for you to even ask. And then they see this and they think, maybe I wasn't aggressive enough. Maybe I should have pushed harder back then. Is that a factor? How big a factor? How should we think about that?
I definitely think, maybe if there is a grand conspiracy, I'm not invited to the meetings, but I think there is a personal aspect of this where they feel like they weren't told the truth and the White House wasn't candid. And I think, you saw that at the press briefing earlier this week when Ed O'Keefe, who is like a complete pro and a really nice person, and definitely has not carried water, I think he's been as tough as and respectful as anybody. He just said, like, hey, we're all getting miffed out here about the way that you guys share or don't share information. And there was a personal edge to that. Reporters don't like feeling like they haven't been told the truth.
Can I make one correction on that, or just one qualification? Not on Alex's point, but on Steve's question. I agree that, look, anytime, and Sarah knows this probably better than all of us, anytime people don't know how something works, they go towards a conspiracy theory to explain it. Everything looks like a conspiracy when you don't know how it works, right? And that's true all sorts of things, because there are no coincidences and all that. That said, part of the thing that's informing a lot of, I think, this impression that the media is wagon circling here or pissed that is being political are things like the George Stephanopoulos interview, which I think was tougher than I expected it to be. And I'm not trying to say it was outrageous, but there were very few questions, if any, about, like, can he do the job? Can he be president of the United States? Can he handle the nuclear codes? Does he know the names of foreign leaders and all that kind of stuff? It was all about, can you win? Right? It was all about the politics. And similarly, I mean, like because we know the granular differences between a reporter and a pundit and a political commentator, that we can make these distinctions professionally, but most people just watch the TV shows and these things wash over them. And what they hear from Democratic politicians and pundits and some reporters and some commentators and some hosts and whatever is only a conversation about the campaign and not about the job. And like the Democrats who are coming out with their statements, none of them are talking about his ability to do the job. They're all talking about Democrats need the person who can most win. So it's not outrageous or unforgivable for a normal person to conclude that this is all about partisan politics and not about anything else, because that's the only conversation that's going on.
And the interview went to George Stephanopoulos, right? Like,
right. If
you're inclined to think that it's a conspiracy, you give the interview to the Democratic partisan. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Sarah, can I ask you a question? Sorry, I'm in question asking mode today. I mean, I think we've seen, when I interviewed Alex Burns and Jonathan Martin about their book, we've talked about that a bunch here. That was back in May of 2022. They had done some reporting on these age issues. We talked to them. Alex Burns said this was a massive concern among Democrats back in the spring of 2022. Asked him a bunch of questions, and Alex raised in that conversation with me this notion of the Fox effect, that if Fox is covering it and if Fox is very interested in it, mainstream journalists really don't want to do that. And I saw that up close when I covered Benghazi. I think there was a big story there. I think it was a legitimate story, but people didn't want to cover it because Fox was covering it. And I will say, because there really were excesses in the Fox coverage of it, right? I mean, Sean Hannity has portrayed Joe Biden as somebody who can't, talk without drooling for 4 years. And I looked this morning and I look at what Sean Hannity is tweeting, and what a lot of people on the right are tweeting, is the fact that Biden pulled out this piece of paper which had the list of reporters he was going to call on at the press conference. That's something that happens in almost every presidential press conference. Literally, I can remember George W. Bush doing it. I think Donald Trump did it. Barack Obama did it. There's nothing at all unusual for a president to have a list of names to call on reporters from. And yet, if you look in sort of right-wing world this morning, that's part of the conspiracy. Sarah, how routine is that? Am I wrong? Am I remembering this wrong? That's a normal part of the way this happens?
Yeah, I mean, I felt the need on Twitter before the press conference to sort of call some balls and strikes on things that are normal and things that aren't normal. I'm happy to, mention all sorts of things that Biden says or does that would really concern me as a staffer. Things that would not concern me as a staffer. Absolutely having a list of names for reporters. So when I ran press conferences, I actually just called on the reporters from the sidelines, because then I would have a better sense of when to end the press conference. Because remember, in a press conference, you want to take as many questions as possible, but every additional question is an opportunity for an error. And at some point, the press corps that has assembled runs out of topical questions. And at some point, you move into the weirdo questions, because they will ask something. They're never going to stop. And so you're trying to cut it off after the end of the topical questions before you get to the bizarro questions that your guy isn't prepped for and that the answer can only be weird. And so because your principal is having to think about the answers to questions, generally speaking, that's what the comms person is doing there. Now, again, I did it from the sidelines, calling on people myself, calling the, last question. Biden did it himself. You can see why they chose to do it that way instead of having the press secretary off on the side calling it. So nothing unusual about that. There was the, why were they moving it? Why were they so late? Boy, is that normal. Again, something that I actually gives me like panic to be running late to a press conference. So, at the Department of Justice, they all started within 2 minutes of the correct time. But I'm literally the only person in DC who ever ran a press conference on time. And there's all sorts of very boring reasons that they run late that people would not believe. He doesn't feel like it. He's chatting with someone. He wanted to return a phone call. He decided to go to the bathroom and it's taking a long time. I mean, I can't tell you the number of reasons that things ran late that I was like, No one would believe this. They're going to think we're having some like last minute changes to the speech. And like, no, that's been put to bed hours ago.
Isn't it kind of bad when you're trying to prove to the whole world that your brain isn't broken to be really late? So all the punditry, all the pregame punditry is all about, will he be able to string two sentences together? Wouldn't you prefer to be on time for that press conference?
Yeah. Again, there's this talk about conspiracy theories. There's this conspiracy theory, I feel like, that is so ubiquitous that it's not even a conspiracy theory, that staff has any control over their principal when it comes to things like this. They don't. And the principal, you can tell him as many times as you want, sir, actually, this time it's really important to be on time. Or, hey, Carly, instead of 45 minutes, could you please just talk for 20 minutes? We don't have 45 minutes to do this. The audience doesn't want 45 minutes. Only talk for 20 minutes. It will have no effect whatsoever. Like, this is who they are. Joe Biden runs late. That's who he is. There was a whole Twitter account dedicated to, how late is the Obama press briefing? And it would just, tweet out how late it had run. 28 minutes would have been a short delay. The last one I wanted to mention was one that I also saw going around. By the way, it doesn't mean it's not political malpractice. Of course it was. He lengthened the amount of time that anyone tuning in for that press conference heard people talking about how he can't be president. It was dumb. I saw one about, whisper, 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 anonymous source. For cabinet meetings, the White House staff would send questions to the cabinet secretary's staff. The cabinet secretary's staff would send their answers back all before the meeting. That's how meetings work with principals. Like, that one I found like particularly not only not egregious, I was like, oh, good, they're running meetings well. You don't walk into a meeting with the president and the attorney general and be like, so what did you want to talk about today, Mr. President? And then he comes up with a topic and you're like, oh, I don't really know. Let me find out the answers to some of that. No, you get the question, you get the answers. Then they spend their time discussing the difficulties of that, ideas to fix the problem. Like, so some of this reporting is very fair on Biden's limitations, and some of it betrays to me people who don't know how high-level government things work behind the scenes. I would like to talk about vice presidents. So, Alex, we saw several questions from reporters at the press conference yesterday about why Joe Biden doesn't want to hand it off to his vice president, trying to get at the idea that, A, do you think she can't win? Do you think you have a better shot at winning against Donald Trump than Harris? B, I particularly liked Asma, a colleague from NPR's question. You ran in 2020 in the primary and then in the general, saying you were going to be a bridge candidate for Democrats. Basically, let the bench of the young people grow up just a little bit more so that they're ready to really take on the big stuff. And then I'm going to step out of the way. And here we are with him not stepping out of the way. What do you hear from the White House and Democrats about Vice President Harris and whether they are more comfortable with her at this point than the president running? What concerns they have about her? How real are these questions?
I can tell you there's more and more Democrats that, they're giving her a second look and they're like, she's looking pretty good. Like literally, this is like some of the most pro Kamala commentary and just like whispers, hot takes that I've seen in a long time. And it goes to, I think, what Steve said, which was, or maybe I know it was Jonah, I think, who basically just said like she can speak. She can make compelling.
This feels like when you show up to the party and you're like, ugh, everyone's so unattractive. And then you have 3 drinks and you're like, maybe not so bad.
I mean, listen, Democrats have been drinking heavily the last 2 weeks. So that could be part of the reason. But yeah, I mean, and the fact is that I do think, the Beltway is a combination of things. Like the White House and a lot of Biden aides don't think that she is as electable as Joe Biden. And it's sort of ironic, though, because they're doing to her what they're still super mad that Obama's people did to him. Yep. And it's just, some of this is just inherent in the vice presidency. But given how much they they complain about the Obama stuff to this day. I find it a little, just a little ironic. I think, her main hurdles beyond, some of the word salad and sort of, trite musings, philosophical musings that she sometimes has. The other problem that she's going to have is, she doesn't have like a really stable staff. I mean, her turnover has been extraordinary. And if she were to sort of ascend to the top of the ticket, what does that staff look like? And is it stable? I think are some of the questions that other Democrats are having. And that's why you still are, even with Jim Clyburn saying, hey, I'm going to be with her. And certainly the path to least resistance, the cleanest thing is to just give her the nomination. There are still a lot of people who want to be Donald Trump that are nervous about just handing it off and not opening things up.
Jonah, this seems to me like two different ways, is it a bunny or is it a duck? Is Joe Biden the most likely to win in November? If you think yes, you stick with Joe Biden. And I think there's plenty of data that will fulfill that narrative, that hypothesis. If you think Joe Biden's definitely going to lose, then you want to take a risk on someone else. And both of those things can actually be true at the same time. But I think it depends which one you're looking at to decide, if you're a Democrat, whether you want Joe Biden to stay the nominee or you want to take a risk on Harris. Because if you think Joe Biden has the best shot, you stick with Biden. If you think that Joe Biden's definitely going to lose, then you're like, why not take a flyer with Harris? Even if she's more likely to lose than Joe Biden, because at least with her, the spectrum of probabilities is broader potentially.
Yeah. I mean, this gets back to the only dishes on the menu are crap sandwiches point, right? And so it's all triage and cost benefit analysis and risk. So that's why I start from the proposition that if you think it is unavoidable that Biden is going to have another bad episode, put yourself in that position 60 days from now and think about how much worse it will be then. So let's figure out a way to minimize that bad outcome and do what we need to do. And look, I mean, I'm kind of obsessive about how so much of this is the result of weak parties. Like if you actually had party leaders that could exercise discipline and control, you would not be in anything like this situation. But that's where we are.
Which also makes the Obama-Biden tension, I think, has really come to the front, because I think if you're an outsider, whatever you want to think of it, and you're seeing James Carville and David Axelrod and the Pod Save America bros all coming out, George Clooney, with his op-ed saying Biden needs to step aside, you're like, whoa, except if you realize that the Biden team has never seen them as allies and think that they were just waiting in the tall grass for this moment. They would love nothing more than to see Biden fall on his face, because it would, first of all, justify everything they ever thought about Joe Biden, and also make Barack Obama look that much better and themselves look that much better, and Biden's team look like they're not as competent. I mean, this isn't about party unity at the Democratic side. This is a long-running feud between Team Biden and Team Obama.
Well, one quick thing, just really quick before you go, Joe, that's been funny is the Biden team has been snarking at George Clooney in the press. They leaked that that Biden was there for a full 3 hours and George Clooney couldn't keep up with Joe Biden. And then they did it just last night in a CNN report. They leaked that Joe Biden had to fly 6 time zones from Italy because George Clooney said that night was the only night that worked for him, and he was being like a Hollywood prima donna. So I think your point is spot on that George Clooney is not the man that's going to sway Joe Biden's ego.
I have a total Iran-Iraq war attitude towards that conflict.
Well, just when it leaked that George Clooney had called Barack Obama to get his permission to run the op-ed, I was like, and scene.
I think the single greatest moment of all, of just the sort of, I mean, you lament that Tom Wolfe is dead, right? I mean, because he would have been great at a lot of this stuff. But Joe Biden calling in to Morning Joe to condemn Democratic elites, it's like giving a speech in Davos condemning all of those economic elites who are trying, but not in a kind of like, it's like going to Davos and saying, I don't mean you guys. I mean, those other economic elites. I mean, to call into Morning Joe and say, I'm taking on the establishment and it's parody.
By the way, worth noting, Steve, since you were talking about Fox effect, that mainstream journalists don't like covering something if Fox is covering it, because then they get lumped in with being, right-wing lunatics. You'll notice there is no MSNBC effect. There is no Joe Scarborough effect. If Joe Scarborough says something, it's not like the mainstream media folks are then like, oh no, we can't possibly talk about that because Joe Scarborough said it. So I would be more willing to buy into this idea of like a bunch of reporters don't want to buy into, partisan hackery. But it doesn't seem to work that way.
Yeah. If anything, I think mainstream reporters watch Morning Joe and take their cues from the framing of a lot of this stuff, honestly.
It was considered the agenda-setting show in the Obama administration. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was Playbook, Morning Joe. Like, if you wanted to know what was going to go on in D.C. that day, it was circular. Like, you had to turn into Morning Joe because the White House was tuning into Morning Joe to figure out what the White House was going to do.
Yeah. Sarah, I just want to point out your framing of the question that you put to Alex just a minute ago, because I think it's the correct framing. And I think it's incredibly depressing because you said in this debate that Democrats are having internally about whether they should sort of jump ship and go from Joe Biden to Kamala. The question they keep asking themselves is, who is the better candidate? Who's more likely to win in November, right? It's just stunning. And again, I mean, I've been doing this for 25 years. I don't think of myself as particularly naive, but it is just stunning how little of the discussion is about Joe Biden's ability to do the job until he's 86, as Alex said. I mean, it really is all about, can he win? Yeah,
I mean, in fairness, as long as they can get him elected, then Harris becomes president. Fine, who cares?
But that's a pretty, I've talked to like some longtime Biden people and some Democrats, and if they're honest, they'll basically admit what you just said, Sarah, which is that there is this very gray moral calculus that you are trying to elect somebody that you do not have confidence can do the job 4 more years. And then also, when is that line? Right. Like, is there a moment when Joe Biden's going to be like, you know what, I am too old?
Right.
That's the problem. He's really proven that he's not going to then, after the day after the inauguration, be like, whew, well, we got that out of the way. Take the reins, Kamala. So that should be concerning. I mean, are you really going to want a 25th Amendment, this guy?
You want to talk about something that would further shake the country's faith in our politics is if he were to do something like that. I mean, I think that would be, if Joe Biden were to remain and win, I think the sooner he's not president, the better off the country will be. And I say that as somebody who obviously I just don't have any love for Kamala Harris. I think she was bad as a candidate. I think she'd be bad as a president. But can you imagine how unsettling that would be to people? Like, this guy campaigns and said, it has to be me, has to be me, has to be me. And then he steps down. I mean, the whole thing would feel like a big joke.
And the alternative is the Democrats having a fight over whether and how to invoke the 25th Amendment.
Yeah.
And Harris, of course, has to be the one to vote to remove the president to become acting president. By the way, she doesn't get to become president if they 25th Amendment him for a disability. She only becomes acting president. I mean, we're in uncharted territory at that point when you become permanent acting president. Only the president can resign and allow her to be sworn in. I mean, that's a bigger mess for them than I think the political mess that you're describing, Steve, which would be the bait and switch.
I saw someone on Twitter say, vote for the cadaver. It's important. Which is a little cruel, but it also sort of gets at the weird otherworldly logic of the situation that we're in,
Alex, how much are you hearing Democrats talk wild hypotheticals, and how much are they just focused on making it through Monday's Lester Holt interview? Like, do they careen between the two? How rational are these conversations happening? Or do they sound like this podcast?
Which category does this podcast go into? I think it's
bonkers down.
If you talk to the donor community, like they're on the board, they're on like the board drawing up every possible scenario. They're sending it around to all their rich friends, linking to like Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias and Josh Barrow, and we could host, and we're gonna have this blitz primary, and we're going to have like CNN town halls with Newsom and Kamala, and like just, they've come up with every single possible scenario.
Never change, donors, never change.
Yes. So when you get to, I'd say there's two categories. When you get to lawmakers, there are people that are having serious conversations about, okay, like, there are some Democrats that feel, Joe Biden has never been a quick decision maker. And there are some Democrats that are like, we have to let him come to the conclusion on his own. And
Grandpa will give up the keys to the Corvette. Just give him a sec.
And get in there. And so there are some Democrats that are like, okay, like game this out a few weeks from now. We need to be prepared for a few weeks from now that there will be another debate-like moment or something else that will come up, trigger another like mini crisis. There are those they're there. And then there are some Democrats that are basically just like, I need to go back to my district and like hold on for dear life and try to win my race. And like, I can't deal with whatever is going on in DC. I can't control it. And that's just where we are. And please, press, don't ask me about it.
Can we talk with our remaining minutes about the other side of this? So Donald Trump's team has been very clear. Chris LaCivita, Susie Wiles, the folks running Trump's campaign, that they would prefer to run against Joe Biden. They want the known over the known unknown of a Harris. Yeah, they think it's a win-win. They think they could beat Harris as well, but they have a whole campaign strategy built around running against Joe Biden. They've been feeding this idea that he is mentally and physically infirm. And obviously that seed has germinated and grown into quite the beanstalk. So perfect. Stick with this. So every day that Joe Biden's in the race, they are happy, but they also have an age issue and they need to pick a vice president. Jonah, they certainly are putting it out there that the list is North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, Florida Senator Marco Rubio, and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. It appears very much like Rubio's off the list at this point. And so it's between Burgum and Vance, but there's always the like Trump surprise could happen. Hey, it's Katie Britt, Elise Stefanik, whatever. Do you think that Trump's vice presidential pick matters at all, depending on whether it's Biden or a different Democrat, or depending on what happens between now and November? Like, vice presidents generally haven't mattered. I have thought that Vice President Harris matters in this race more so than any vice president in modern American history, because people think that she will become president if Joe Biden were to win. They're not picking a vice president. They're picking a president. I don't know that people have that same sense about Donald Trump, that Donald Trump's pick for VP would become president in some like actuarially likely scenario. And if it's not that, vice presidents generally haven't actually made any electoral difference. So is this worth our time?
Oh, I think, well, first of all, this is the life we have chosen. So, just suck it up.
Is it worth Alex's time to listen to this drivel?
And you're just completely ignoring the fact that the president of the United States said that Donald Trump is his vice president last night. So, which... The
memes have been great. They have one now with Vice President Harris and Zelensky, and someone says, see the collusion between Trump and Putin. Pretty well done, actually.
So I think, first of all, for governing stuff, I think it matters enormously right now. Because...
Really? Say more.
Vance represents something, the populist nationalist takeover of the Republican Party, or the insurgency within it. But
that's like saying Harris represents the very progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But once you become vice president, you got to do whatever the big guy says. And Harris hasn't really gotten to fly her progressive freak flag.
Yeah. My only point is that long term, it's not, there's a non-trivial chance that Donald Trump doesn't finish a term. And there's a non-trivial chance that whoever he picks as vice president inherits something of the mantle of the MAGA faction of the GOP. If he had picked Rubio, you could see a post-Trump world where the Republican Party has a regression to the mean of the pre-Trump party. With Vance, he is the hero. He's the avatar of the people who don't want to go back. And he believes that stuff, particularly on foreign policy. So I think that stuff matters. And we know from Pence in the first Trump administration, because Trump doesn't care about a lot of things, Pence had a huge role in influencing staffing at the non-sexy stuff, at the margins, the stuff that mattered for actual governing. Vance could play the same role and seed a Trump administration with, mini Kash Patels all over the place, that kind of thing. So it's worth keeping in mind.
My nightmare. So yesterday I had to clear out this pile. And it was Mad Max meets Heart of Darkness in my garage, piles of dead flies and then dozens of spiders gorging on the dead flies. That's one version of having Kash Patels everywhere.
So, but to answer your original question, just very quickly, electorally, I do think it matters at the margins. The Trump people believe, and I think they're right to believe, they have a problem with women. They have a problem on abortion. That's why they've beclowned the pro-life movement and the Heritage Foundation and all these people to sort of seem moderate or claim to be moderate. I'm your feminist ally, Sarah, but I don't want to speak for you. I don't feel like J.D. Vance is the guy you pick to win over the sort of Mika Brzezinski voter. I don't know that he solves any of their gender gap problems. So I think he could matter in that respect in a way that even Doug Burgum and Marco Rubio could have improved things, or never mind a female running mate.
You haven't heard J.D. Vance's wife. She would crush it on Morning Joe.
Better believe.
She's incredible. Yeah. Alex, is this a little bit like the Princess Bride scene about which cup the poison is in? Like when they hear that Donald Trump is pumped to run against Joe Biden and Joe Biden's staying is exactly what the Trump team wants. It's a little bit like, yes, but a smart person would know better than to put the poison in his own cup. Like, did they think they're playing 3D, 5D chess here? Or do they understand that this is what Republicans think is best for them?
I think it's a combination of not 5D chess, but really just trolling. I think they're trying to make the Democrats overthink it.
So it is Princess Bride.
Yeah. I mean, a little bit. It's just like a little bit of trolling. And then I also think there's probably, Tim Alberta wrote this great piece in The Atlantic that, I think he knows those people. There is a sincerity to the fact that they've been planning to run against Joe Biden, and they think they feel very confident. Again, they can beat Joe Biden. I think they feel confident they can beat anybody, but the less predictable is probably for them a little bit worse at this moment.
Steve, do you see a difference between Burgum and Vance and actually how an administration would go?
The bigger difference is probably what, accepting the mantle of Trumpism without Trump and sort of MAGA plus. I mean, I think J.D. Vance has shown himself very malleable, to put it in the most charitable possible way. Philosophically, he has become sort of Trump plus in the way that he makes arguments. He has become very committed to the kind of magnified view of the world and the policy prescriptions that flow from that. I think Doug Burgum is more of an empty vessel. He, it's not that he's without ideology, but he is a successful businessman who has undoubtedly learned lessons over the decades of being a successful businessman, and I think would be likely to apply those to the vice presidency. If it were Marco Rubio, I think he's sort of the hardest to predict. I've been doing a bunch of reporting for a profile that may never run of Marco Rubio, sort of an updated profile, but in talking to a lot of people in his orbit, there's a big split in Rubio world about whether the Marco Rubio that we're seeing right now is closer to what Marco Rubio actually believes, or if the Marco Rubio that I came to know when I covered his Senate primary in 2010, which is closer to the Tea Party anti-government Marco, is the true Marco. And I think you have people who've known Marco for literally decades who are on opposite sides of that. People who have worked for Marco, know him on a personal level, who say, yeah, actually he's sort of evolved to this point, and this is actually who he always was. He just now is able to be freer about it. And a lot of other people, and I tend to side with the second group, a lot of other people who say, no, basically he was this kind of quasi-establishment Florida former Speaker of the House who just emphasized Tea Party style issues more in 2010 to win a race, but actually believes those more than he believes the kind of industrial policy Marco stuff that we're hearing from him now. But in it, if he were to be picked and Trump were not to serve out his term and Marco were to become president, I do think we would see, especially as it relates to Vance or compared to Vance, we would see something much more like a traditional Republican, older, limited government style presidency in a Marco Rubio than we would be in J.D. Vance, who I think is, his inclination is to sort of continue to plus it up.
Here's what I see as the big problem and why I'm surprised that we're down to this list. You have to assume that Trump feels like he learned something from picking Mike Pence. Obviously, he thinks that was a mistake. So what should have been the takeaways if you don't want to repeat that mistake? A, having someone with their own political ambitions, and B, having someone who deep down has principles, is smart and well thought of in a greater sort of DC sense. And therefore, when push really comes to shove, they're going to pick themselves over you, their own political ambitions over you. And there are going to be principles that they have once they get the thing that are going to be red lines. I actually J.D. Vance is the poster child of having his own ambitions. Yep, he's saying all the things he needs to say right now to get the vice presidency. And then his whole goal is to become president. So if you ask him to do something that he thinks hurts his chances of becoming president, I don't know that he's going to do it. Don Jr. made the point about how he doesn't want his father to pick Marco Rubio because then Republicans would have an incentive to impeach Donald Trump. Love this new political theory, by the way. You don't want to pick a vice president who helps you politically. You want to pick one who hurts you politically because it's an insurance policy. I mean, honestly, it's what Biden is living on. Can you imagine if Joe Biden had Amy Klobuchar as his vice president right now? People would have driven him out to the country and left him there, a la Admiral Stockdale in the SNL skit.
Just for the record, I've been making this argument about Trump for a long time, that he wants the scariest vice presidential pick possible that does not cost him the election. Like if he could get away with having Lauren Boebert in there, because what he wants is to become president and then hold up like Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene like a Medusa's head and say, you can't impeach me. And yeah, I think that's real.
Which makes none of these three options make any sense. I would have said Doug Burgum because he has no sort of political future on his own, but the guy ran for president. So he thinks he has a political future on his own, regardless of whether that's realistic or not. And none of this makes a lot of sense to me, honestly. And it's odd for Donald Trump to trust. I mean, it continues to be odd for Donald Trump to see someone who trashed him in the most serious of terms and then has this come to Jesus moment over and over again. He likes those people because he prefers someone who he won over. It feeds his ego more than someone who was always with him. That's the J.D. Vance argument. It always has been. But again and again, those are the very people who then end up reverting back to who they really are. And J.D. Vance, at the end of the day, is an incredibly smart, well-educated lawyer with a brilliant wife who's not going to let him do insurrections, for instance. So I don't know that he's really fixing his Pence problem here. All right. Final word to you, Alex. I don't know. What are you most interested in? What story are you gnawing at to get answers to right now between now and the Republican convention or the Democratic roll call?
I sort of agree with Jonah that so much the coverage is about how this will affect the election in November. I think I'm much more interested. I've long had this weird side interest in presidential health. And I wrote
that is a weird side
interest. I wrote a whole 5,000 word piece on presidents and mental health and JFK taking psychotropics on the side and ways to manage the anxiety of being president. Anyway, so I'm very interested.
It's funny. I'm reading this book called The Daughters of Yalta by Catherine Grace Katz. And many, obviously this book was written a little while ago. Many times she talks about FDR's failing health going into the Yalta conference. And it sounds so much like Joe Biden limiting his schedule, that he's having trouble focusing in meetings. Anyway, so this is not a new problem.
Yeah. And the ways that White Houses conceal it is not new. So
yes. His daughter.
And in this case, it's a lot of the family, right? I'm much more interested in other ways that his that his health has been affecting his presidency. And because it would suggest how it will affect the presidency in the future. So those are the things that I'm really interested in. I'm also interested in like the doctor stuff, right? It took us it's interesting. There is not really a Fox effect on this story right now because the New York Post is the first one that reported that this Parkinson's doctor had visited the White House, and then you saw a swarm, right? And I'm also interested, like, hey, were there any other doctor visits, back in Delaware? Because there aren't visitor logs for that. Like, I'm interested to see, is there more to this story than we already know? Not just how does this affect the election?
That's funny. I had a friend from the George W. Bush administration who texted me last week and said, why isn't anyone following the Delaware story? There's no White House visitor logs. Every White House knows that if you want to have a secret meeting, you do it at the home because there's no logs. And I was like, huh.
And he has spent, I tried to get the numbers on this. He's
huge amounts of time.
Nearly between a quarter and a half of his time as president in Delaware.
Right. Well, that's where the classified documents were, Jonah. So with that, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. It was such a treat to have you join a Dispatch podcast. And I'm sorry that Steve and Jonah were here, but I couldn't do much about it. Next time, we'll do it in Delaware, so that way they won't know where we are.
So good to be here.
We'll talk to you next week.